Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo and, yes, might just be a little bit radical. In business, we all know that getting the right people in the right positions is key to our success. However, research shows that, in general, hiring is broken. If you're a woman, for example, you have to submit 30% more applications than a man to get through a CV screening. If you're a person of colour, it's even worse. You have to submit 50% more applications than your white counterparts. So how do we change this? Well, joining me today is Linnea Bywall, former psychologist and head of people and operations at Alva Labs, a platform helping businesses reduce bias and improve the hiring process for both candidate and employer. Linnea, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Great. So we start with a little bit radical you. So if you are a little bit radical and you're on this podcast, so you are, we've decided already that you are, what do you think in your early life has set you up for that?
I was thinking about this yesterday and I realized, obviously, in my mind, I'm not radical at all because I'm used to me, but I guess people from the outside might think differently. So we'll take the outside perspective, I guess. So when I was younger, I ran track and field. So I was running the 100s and the 200s and the 400s. And my coach, Peter, was a psychologist. And he was the most radical person I knew. When he was active himself, he used a gin bottle as a water bottle just to freak people out. So I thought he was so cool and I wanted to be like him. And he was a psychologist, so I obviously had to be one of those. And then when I joined the psychologist program, I realized that, I had no clue what a psychologist actually did. And it turns out that they just listen to people. And I like talking way more than I like listening. So that was a terrible match. And so I realized I had to do something different with that degree. And quite early on found a love for industrial and organizational psychology, where I realized that you could, talk and be a psychologist and impacting business rather than helping people, I guess. So I tried to pursue that as a career, realized that the most common way to work as an industrial organizational psychologist is as a consultant, often having like your own company. And I'm way too much of an extrovert, again, like talking too much to have that. So I found HR, where I could kind of benefit from both being a psychologist and learned, that I knew about people and how people work and how you can impact behaviors and stuff like that, but also got to talk a lot. So here I am, 35 years later, 3.5 years later, feels like 35 sometimes. But now I am the head of people, as you said, at Alva Labs, pretending to know stuff about HR, pretending to know stuff about psychology, and hopefully finding a good mix to create something hopefully a little bit radical in the field of HR and hiring.
Fantastic. What an interesting background you have. And there's a couple of things that occurred to me and with other people we're speaking to on this podcast. So the unusual collision of things. So your psychology background, but then with your extroversion and trying to find, often with the kind of collision of things that don't quite seem to fit, that's when something a little bit radical can happen. Would you say that's fair with you?
I think that's a great way to put it. I was a bit of an odd bird at the psychologist program, where I met fantastic people. I learned so much, but I was not like them. But hopefully I got the best of both worlds, meaning I can take some of the, fantastic stuff from psychology and the perspective of human beings and, neuropsychology and all of that, and then bring it into to something else. So I hope you're right.
Absolutely. As you've gone through your life, and your career, do you feel yourself becoming more radical or less radical?
I guess more radical, simply because it's a lot easier for me now to know what I stand for. It takes, at least for me, it took some time to kind of find my place and, you know, my purpose, what I believe in, what matters to me, and what I really like have a passion for. And now that I'm exploring that more, I think it's a lot easier to stand for a clear standpoint. Before, it was more, I had ambitions, but very much more like vague thoughts on who I was, I guess. So definitely more radical with time. So let's see where this ends.
I think that's a great point. I've found that personally as well, as I've got older and become surer of myself. You are, I suppose, less afraid of being slightly outside of normal, whatever that means, outside of the status quo. And you learn that you can be yourself and actually people respect you for that. Have you found the same thing?
Yeah, and I think like maybe jumping in with a psychologist's point of view here, I think it's really interesting. And a couple of years back, because now when you mention normal, like when we talk about normal in like psychology, we often use the bell curve of normal distribution. So either Google it if you haven't heard of it, or just picture a like hill. It's flat in the beginning, and then it goes up, and then it goes down on the other side. That's like the distribution of most traits in human traits. And if you back things up a few years, the normal span were actually like wider. The more research has evolved, the more we learn about like the human behaviors and such, the normal is actually shrinking. And then I mean like more and more people are actually being like diagnosed for different things. So the norm is actually getting slimmer and slimmer, which I find like really, really interesting. So I guess there will be more people for you to interview on this podcast as we progress, because more and more people will be considered radical and different from the rest.
That's a great perspective. I love that. And I think you're right. I mean, the whole reason that we wanted to start this podcast was that we didn't feel that being at least a little bit radical, we kind of feel like almost everyone is a little bit radical. We want to kind of encourage people to embrace that about themselves and, you know, help people realize their slightly radical ideas, because it's an exciting place to be. Let's move on to your work now and how you've been a little bit radical, perhaps, in your work. So you work for Alva Labs, which is a platform helping people hire the best people, right? And you are head of people for that company. Does that feel like a lot of pressure?
I think I was discussing this with a fellow head of people person yesterday. I am an expert in hiring, working for a company that is an expert in hiring, meaning it's hard for me to look good because everyone already knows my tricks. But it does put a lot of pressure, I guess. I really want us to like lead by example as a company. Meaning like we help others recruit better, and therefore we obviously need to be like the best. So I have really, really high standards for our ways of working. And we actually have like the mission for me and my like HR team is actually that we want our team to be the pitch for the company, where we can actually use the company to show that the product is working, if you want. So I guess it's a lot of weight on my shoulders to not fail.
Yes, of course. Yeah. But I think that's the best way to be. Like, you can't do your work authentically if you think you're doing something different to what the company promises to your clients, you know, and your customers. So I think that's fantastic. What would be the top elements of your hiring process for your own team? Talking about that and how you're intent on that being best practice. What are the top elements that you think are a little bit different, perhaps a little bit radical to the way that companies traditionally hire?
Yeah, great question. I think one aspect is that we are very obsessed with data and like doing the process in a data-driven way from start to finish. That means that like early on, like when we try to find out like what is it that we're hiring for, we actually set up what we called a like combined role fit page, where we, based on what we're looking for, design the process, like what method should we use, in what way to best assess the traits that we are looking for. And we actually put a number on each method where we decide like a weight to each method. So say that the interviews that we're using, they should weigh in like 20 or 30% of the overall decision. The work sample test that we use, that should weigh 15% of the overall decision, and so forth. So we have locked the way that we run the process and how we make decisions before we even like tell the world that we're looking for a new coworker. I think that's one thing that I, at least in my experience, see very rarely in other companies. But it's such a like powerful way to, at the end of the process, rely on. We had an example just like the other week where we had like 2 final candidates that had gone through the process, and I was discussing the performance of their work sample test, which is the final step of the process in that case. And they had really liked one candidate better in the case. And then we could backtrace the overall performance so that we wouldn't, rely too much on our gut feeling in just one situation, because we had measured a bunch of things. And that actually then impacted who got the job in the end, because we could see like the overall picture in a much more data-driven way. So I guess that's one aspect of how we do things a little bit radical. The second thing, which is quite obvious based on the company that I work for, is, we sell psychometric assessments, so personality and logic assessments. We use that as the very, very first step of our hiring process. Historically, that has been very unusual, but it is based on research, based on experience from a lot of companies, ours as just one example, is helping us hire in a much more fair, transparent, efficient, and accurate way. So when a candidate applies for a job at Alva, they will answer a few screening questions, and then they don't have to send in a cover letter, they don't have to send in a resume, but they will automatically be sent a personality test and a logic test. And based on those 2 aspects, we will then move forward with the candidates that are most suitable for the job based on who they are, rather than what they have done before. Because if we look at what research tells us about hiring, the common way to hire is to look at years of experience, previous positions, what industry have you been in. Those aspects, they say something about how someone will perform on the job, but very, very, very little. And they're still today gatekeepers for the majority of organizations out there. So we try to kind of flip that around and focus on the person in the first part of the process. And then we can focus more on hard skills later in the process. So I guess that could be seen as a little bit radical too.
That sounds very radical. So your data backs up that those markers like years of experience are actually, I'm guessing, a bad way of getting candidates through a first stage of a hiring process. Is that fair?
That's exactly right. And that's not just our data. That's actually meta studies from actual scientists looking at research from 100 years of studies for across industries, across countries, where years of experience actually correlates very poorly with job performance. But it's easy, right? It's really easy to read how long has someone been a manager. But I think the obvious example is if we think about experience. Say someone has been a manager for 5 years. They could have been the worst manager alive, but they still have the experience, right, to apply for the next job. Or if we take education, for instance, if you think back to all the people that you studied with, would you hire all of them? I'm yet to meet someone that screams yes to that question. But on paper, you're the same. So I think it's very intuitive to understand that it doesn't help, but still we use it because it's such a simple measurement of something. And we have to measure something, right? Otherwise, we are not doing our job as recruiters. But I would argue that the gap between theory and practice is so wide when it comes to HR in general, but in recruitment particularly. And if I may use an example that I find funny, say that you're head of marketing and you're going to decide how you're going to, spend your marketing budget. And you have data that backs up that, the webinars that you're running, they're performing really, really poorly. You're not getting leads. It's not converting. It's not helping the sales funnel. But you love webinars, so you're going to continue to do them anyway. I mean, no marketeer would ever fall into that trap. But that's how recruitment works way too often. Like, we have data that we don't really look at because we think that we know, because we know people. And that's just fooling ourselves, because it's really, really hard to assess individuals. We're really poor at it, actually.
I mean, you're blowing my mind, Linnea. It's so interesting. I mean, by the way, as a head of marketing, I'm pretty sure there are plenty of marketers who do exactly the mistake that you say, by the way.
Really?
Yeah, that they really like an activity, and so, or everyone else is doing that activity, so we've got to do this, without actually looking at the data, or at least trusting or at least believing in a process, really. Like, even if you're not getting immediate results, really having a look at that process and what that's trying to achieve. There's just very sort of hyper focus on goals and achieving goals as quickly as possible, and that leads to some pretty shoddy practices, I think. It sounds like in hiring, everyone's just kind of following the crowd. This is the way everyone does it, but
exactly.
But it's broken, and you've got a far more robust way of doing this.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, and I think I have I was number 14 into this company, and now we're plus 75 people. Just over the last year and a half, we have had almost 7,000 candidates applying for positions at Alva, which is, amazing and absolutely fantastic. But there's no way me and my team could have made sound hiring decisions if we didn't have data-driven, evidence-based tools to actually help us. We would be completely blind. So yeah, it's a lot easier.
That's a really interesting point as well. So that's a situation we've run into at Standing on Giants as well, where we have hundreds of applicants for one position, and in a small company, there's a huge workload that goes along with going through those applications, and I suppose that's when it's easy to start relying on these kind of old systems and kind of not use a more robust method. Where I'm going with this is I'd like to talk to you about gut feel in hiring and instincts. And I imagine that a lot of hiring decisions are made on a gut feel and instinct. Maybe from a psychologist's point of view, and then from a professional point of view. What is gut feel actually? What is instinct? And should we trust it or should we not?
I mean, you can define it in a different way, but I think one way to define it is our combination of experience and knowledge, things that we have experienced in the past, will help us kind of view the world. I see it as everyone will put on different glasses and view the world through their individual lenses, and the glasses are designed by who they are. Their individual traits, but also their past. So we can be, 10 people experiencing the same situation, but we experience it through these lenses. And since the lenses will impact what we pick up on and not, we will all have different experience of that situation. So the gut feeling can be, I guess, summarized as your past experiences and how that impacts your attitude towards a situation, a person, a piece of performance or whatever. And as you said, I think this is one of the biggest challenges in hiring. So moving over to the professional perspective of this, I guess. I mean, I've studied psychology for 7 years. I've worked with recruitment for almost 10 years now. I'm really, really bad at assessing individuals because I'm human, and the human brain simplifies things. I mean, if you think about it, if you go to a mingling event, whether you hate it or not, that's but depending on who you are, but still you're there, you're gonna mingle, and obviously you're gonna very, very quickly make an assumption about someone based on how they look, based on how they talk, based on how they approach you. And why are we doing this? Because it's great for our survival. So like back in the days, we had to make like really snap judgments because it impacted how like who would live or not. And no one will die from a mingling event, but we still have the same brain as our ancestors. So we do this like snap judgments so that we can, instead of wondering like who is this person, we can focus on the conversation. And the same brain on the mingling event is the same brain in the like interview process, in the CV screening process in hiring. So we make very, very fast judgments based on pieces of information that we will value very, very differently based on who we are. And this causes like the stats that you mentioned at the beginning. Like women have to send in 30% more applications not because people don't like women, not because organizations don't want to hire women, but because the kind of norm around like who's a good performer often involves a lot of like male attributes. And this is not a like conscious decision, but it's something that kind of just like we have with us and we don't even realize it. So these biases will impact what we view are like a good candidate versus a not good candidate. People that are very similar to you will be another good example where we tend to like people that have made the same choices as ourselves because that, confirms our way of living. So if you meet a candidate that, I'm an ex-runner, if I meet a candidate that also a runner, instant love. If they're also an extrovert, even more love. Whether if they met someone, another recruiter that hated running and was more of a listener than I am, then we would judge or assess that person very differently. So it creates a very unfair situation where people are judged by attributes that doesn't really matter, that are actually even like illegal to base your hiring decisions on. So, it's illegal to discriminate about like based on gender, based on age, based on ethnicity, but those things are still very, very real because we are humans. And that's what fascinates me, is that people really have high ambitions when it comes to diversity and inclusion, but they're still, blocking themselves when it comes to hiring.
Yeah. Oh, what a fantastic answer. There's probably more efforts around diversity and inclusion than there's ever been at the moment. Unconscious bias training is a popular thing. From what you were saying, is unconscious bias training doomed to fail because there's something so embedded in how we are as humans that we will always make those value judgments, no matter how much we try and override our kind of lizard brain, and do we need something else to support those decisions?
Yeah, I'm going to make some enemies now. Sorry. But yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Research actually shows that, bias training, it can be good for awareness so that you actually have like buy-in to drive the real processes and initiatives that you need to do. But it doesn't actually change something because a awareness training can never change the design of the human brain. And it's not that, we want to do these things, but even when we are aware of it, we can't take off these like glasses where we see the world through. We can't. So great for awareness, but it should only be for awareness because then you have to get to actual work when it comes to diversity and inclusion.
Of course, yeah. And so we need other support, we need other support to help us make those decisions. And I imagine that you, obviously you work for a technology solution. Is technology the answer? Or do we need other things as well to help us?
I think it's part of the answer. I think the beauty with technology is that technology doesn't care what gender you have, what, your last name is, how old you are. It will treat everyone the same. And that's the beauty, and that's how it can help. But it's not like necessarily a silver bullet that solves everything. So you can, sit home and relax and do nothing else. Diversity and inclusion, like hiring in a data-driven way is one aspect, but then It's the whole like creating very transparent policies, working with your culture, working with like psychological safety, and that needs to be done, I guess human to human to some extent in some instances. So it's an aid, yes, that we need, but it's not the full picture.
Of course, I suppose where my brain goes with that is that if we don't change how we think about hiring, about our institutions, about what we should be valuing, then we will just deploy a technology which confirms what we thought before, right? So we do need to think about it first, and then use technology in an ethical way to support us overcoming our shortcomings.
I guess that's the radical part in it, where you need to do something differently. And I think it's hard to go into an area like such as recruitment and say like, we're doing it all wrong. Here's how you should do it. But it's actually very true, but maybe not always so popular.
Well, that's a great point, and I think brings us on to a good next question. What advice would you give to hiring managers or other professionals in businesses where they want to introduce this slightly radical change for getting buy-in? What's the best approach?
I think there's a bunch of different ways you can tackle this. One thing is, I think you need to use data so that you can show what is it that we can impact. What's your, diversity numbers looking like today? How many like good hires are you actually making? I think we need to move away from just focusing on like time to hire, for instance, my worst hiring metric in the world, and more focus on like quality of hires. So how many people are performing well? How many people are staying on the job? And then setting out to change those aspects. So looking at data. And then I think it's about like an easy exercise that I think all organizations, if they haven't already done it, should do it. It can take like 15 minutes, but that is to look at the process you're having today and just go in and try to see it with like intent in every activity as the guiding star. Like everything that you put into your process need to have a purpose. It needs to actually help you make good decisions. If we take like the cover letter, for instance, if we have intent in every activity and we know that the cover letter, it's time consuming for the candidate, it's time consuming for the recruiter, and it tells us, sorry, but shit, it doesn't help us actually make good decisions, then why are we doing it? If we say like some companies will have, 7 interviews in their hiring process. If we again put on the like intent in every activity perspective, and we know that after like 3, maybe 4 interviews, you're just measuring the same thing over and over again. So you're wasting time. Then there's no point of keeping it. So I think having that mindset of like making everything count is super important. And then obviously like the third aspect I would advise people to take in is structure. Adding like a structured process where you know what you're looking for, you know what way you're going to do it, you know what order you're going to do it, so that you can commit to giving every candidate the same chance. That means that you should have, the same questions for all candidates. One good example now in this like hybrid way of working, don't have some interviews on site and some interviews via Zoom. It doesn't matter which one you pick, but you need to do the same. So introducing structure, and it can be, a massive project, but do one small iteration at a time. Try for like one process rather than like, oh, let's plan out this for a year and a half, but not get started. So I guess that would be my send home message to people. Structure,
and put the little in the little bit radical, a little piece at a time. Our CEO always likes to tell us that old mantra, how do you eat a mammoth? One bite at a time, which I've never quite understood, but it ultimately means this, right? Start and do one thing at a time. Because otherwise, if you spend all the time planning, by the time you've actually got the plan, it's a completely overwhelming amount of work and you won't do it anyway, right?
Yeah, and the mammoth has gone bad. It's rotten by then.
Yes. Oh, great example. There we go. I get that metaphor in a new way. So we're gonna lift you out of the day-to-day now, and we're gonna turn our focus outwards to the world and hear about your ideas that are a little bit radical for the world. What's a change that you would like to see in the world at large that's a little bit radical?
What I would love to see is a redefinition of what talent is. As I see it, the old way of viewing talent is through a CV. It's if you have gone to that school, if you have worked in that particular super cool company, it's if you have that fancy title, and that's how you get the new opportunities. That's how you get to the next job and get the next chance, and that just leaves so much off the table, because then it will be this small group of the society that will over and over again have the best chances, because not everyone will be privileged to be able to go to that school or will work at that company, but that's not necessarily meaning that they aren't as talented, as suitable for a certain job, can't make all the difference in the world. So if we could instead view talent as, more soft skills, more attitude, more like traits, like who the individual is, I think that would not only benefit a wider spread of the candidate pool available on the market, it would also help companies opening up their opportunities that they can offer the world to so many more individuals. They would have a lot more to pick from. They wouldn't have to, spend as much time sourcing those candidates that everyone else is after, because you can actually find talent elsewhere. It would be a much more efficient kind of job market where more people will have equal opportunities. We would actually be able to drive company performance in a much cooler way. I think one good statistic to throw in here, approximately 5% of the employees in an organization will stand for 26% of the outcome. So very, very few are actually creating a lot of the results for the organization. And to my point again, that type of talent is not based on where you came from, where you grew up, this color of your skin. It has nothing to do with that. It's so much more tied to who you are as an individual, your natural way of behaving. And if you can understand what is needed for this role in the soft skill aspect and find that, then you will be miles ahead of your competitors. So I just find it fascinating how companies are, fishing in the same tiny little pond where there's so much potential and where there's so many people out there that are screaming for job opportunities, but that they never get the chance, where they could be one of those 5%. So that's my wish for the world, I guess.
That's wonderful. I'm with you on that one. And I like what you said. I love that stat that 5% of an organization drive 25% of an outcome. From my experience, the ability to achieve outcomes, exactly like you say, is not based on your personal ability to do things. It's about your ability to move people and collaborate and activate people, inspire people, focus people, all of those things. And the assumption that if you went to a top university or a top school, you're going to have more of those skills, I think has been proven wrong time and again. You only need to look at who's in those top positions to see that, right?
Yeah.
Linnea, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the Little Bit Radical podcast. Do you have a final thing that you would like to say to our listeners? If they have a little radical idea, what would you say to those people if they've got a little snippet of something that they'd like to make a change? What would you say to them?
Find someone that shares that passion so you can bounce ideas with someone. It's, at least for me, I'm stupid when I can't think out loud with someone else. So that would be one thing. And then try small, start somewhere to try it out, because you won't know unless you tried. And it's just going to take too much time if you, again, overplan. The mammoth will rotten, pretty much.
Fantastic. Linnea, thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much and speak to you next time.